Miami County, 911.
Oh my God, somebody broke into my home. Somebody broke into my home and shot my wife.
Are they still in there?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, what's the address?
Please hurry. Please hurry.
She had no reason to believe that night would be her last. Andrea Flynn was 26 years old. She was a wife, a daughter, a woman with a whole future still waiting to happen. By all accounts, she was kind, quiet, the kind of person who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. But at 2:30 in the morning on a cold Ohio night, in the bedroom of her own home in Tipp City, Andrea was shot and killed. And the man who called 911 to report it was her husband. His name was Caleb Flynn. Some people might recognize that name. A few years before this night, Caleb had stood on the American Idol stage. He had sung in front of millions of viewers. He had chased a dream. He had smiled for cameras and charmed audiences and let the whole country watch him reach for something bigger than himself. That version of Caleb Flynn seemed like a completely different person from the man detectives would encounter in the hours and days that followed. Because the story Caleb told about what happened to Andrea did not add up, not even a little. This is the story of a woman who deserved better. This is the story of a crime scene that had been carefully arranged. And this is the story of how investigators peeled back every layer of a carefully constructed lie until nothing was left but the truth. What really happened in that bedroom is something the evidence could not hide. Tipp City is a small town. It sits in Miami County in western Ohio, about an hour north of Cincinnati. Most people who live there will tell you it is the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where crime feels distant, where a 2:30 in the morning phone call to 911 is rare enough to startle a dispatcher out of routine. On the night in question, the town was quiet. The streets were dark and still. Autumn had settled in and the air had that particular chill that makes people want to stay inside, close their curtains, and sit by something warm. Inside, the Flynn home life had been unfolding in the ordinary way that lives do. Caleb and Andrea had been married for a few years. They shared a house, shared routines, shared the small negotiations that every marriage is built from. From the outside, there was nothing visibly wrong. There was nothing that neighbors could point to later and say that was the sign. But inside that house, something had been building. Investigators would later describe the relationship between Caleb and Andrea as troubled. There were tensions. There were disagreements that had grown heavier over time. The details of their private struggles would only become fully visible in hindsight, the way the cracks in a foundation are only noticed once the structure has already started to fall. That night, by most accounts, there was nothing unusual about how the evening began. Caleb was home. Andrea was home. Whatever was happening between them, it was contained within those walls, invisible to the outside world. The hours passed. The neighborhood went to sleep. The lights in the surrounding houses went dark one by one. Tipp City settled into the deep, undisturbed quiet of a small-town night. It would not stay quiet for long. At 2:27 in the morning, a phone rang in the Miami County 911 dispatch center. The 911 call lasted several minutes. Caleb Flynn was on the other end of the line. His voice carried a quality that dispatchers are trained to listen for carefully. There was distress, there was urgency, but dispatchers are also trained to notice what is absent, and something in the texture of that call would stay with the people who heard it. Caleb told the dispatcher that there had been a home invasion. He said that an intruder had broken into the house. He said that his wife had been shot. He said she was in the bedroom. He said he needed help right now. On the surface, every word was correct. Every element was present. Home invasion, intruder, victim, emergency. But emergency dispatchers are experienced. They have heard thousands of calls. They know what shock sounds like. They know what terror sounds like. They know the particular quality of a voice that belongs to someone who has just witnessed something unimaginable. And something about this call felt slightly off. Not dramatically, not in a way that you could point to immediately and call a lie. Just slightly, a degree or two away from where it should have been. Officers were dispatched immediately. The address was logged. Patrol cars rolled toward the Flynn residence through the empty streets. The dispatcher stayed on the line with Caleb, asking questions, maintaining contact, doing everything the protocol required. Caleb answered those questions, but the answers, like the call itself, had a quality to them that was hard to define in the moment and impossible to ignore in retrospect. When officers arrived at the home, they found Caleb outside. He was standing near the entrance. He was visibly upset. He directed them inside. He told them where to find Andrea. The officers went in. What they found in that bedroom would change the course of the entire investigation. Andrea Flynn was dead. There was no way to soften that sentence, and there was no reason to try. She was found in the bedroom, and as Caleb had said, she had been shot. The wound was fatal. She had no chance. The first officers on scene did what first officers always do. They secured the area. They checked for any immediate threats. They called for additional units and for the investigators who would need to take over. They made sure the house was clear, and then they began to look. What they saw in that bedroom was a crime scene. But it was also something else. It was a story. Crime scenes always tell a story. That is the fundamental principle of forensic investigation. Every object in a room is positioned by either chance or intent. Every mark on a surface, every displaced item, every open window and overturned piece of furniture is either the result of what happened or the result of someone wanting you to believe something happened. The bedroom of the Flynn home had details that read as consistent with a home invasion. Signs of disturbance, evidence of a struggle or what looked like a struggle, the kind of details that a person imagining a home invasion might think to include. But as trained eyes moved through the room, something became increasingly clear. The details did not feel right. The positioning of certain items, the pattern of disturbance, the way specific elements of the scene related to each other spatially. Crime scene investigators who have processed dozens and hundreds of real scenes develop an intuition that is hard to articulate but impossible to dismiss. This scene had the elements of a home invasion, but it did not have the feel of one. It felt arranged. It felt like someone had studied the idea of a home invasion and then tried to build one from the outside in without understanding that reality never looks exactly like imagination. Investigators said nothing yet. They documented, they photographed, they moved carefully through the space, preserving everything. But the conclusion was already beginning to form. The question was not whether the scene had been staged. The question was by whom and how investigators were going to prove it. In the immediate aftermath of a homicide, the clock moves differently for everyone involved. For investigators, it moves fast. Every hour that passes is an hour during which evidence can degrade, memories can shift, and whoever is responsible can take one more step away from the truth. The first 24 hours of a homicide investigation are the most critical. Everyone who has ever worked a murder case knows this. For Caleb Flynn, the clock seemed to move in a strange way. He had been separated from the scene. He was being handled by officers. He was in a state that on the surface looked like grief. He was saying the right things. He was doing the right things. He was performing, if that is the right word, exactly as a husband who had just lost his wife to a violent home invasion might be expected to perform. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They asked neighbors whether they had seen or heard anything in the hours before the 911 call. They asked about unusual vehicles, unusual people, anything that might corroborate the story of an intruder entering the Flynn home. The answers were not what the theory required. No one had seen anything unusual, no unfamiliar cars, no strangers walking through the neighborhood, no sounds that might indicate a break-in or a confrontation. Tipp City was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that makes a stranger stand out. And no stranger had been standing out. Then came the security cameras. The area around the Flynn home was covered by a combination of residential security cameras and traffic monitoring systems. Investigators began pulling that footage. They looked for evidence of any vehicle or person approaching and leaving the house in the window that mattered. They looked for the intruder that Caleb had described. The footage told its own story. There was no intruder. There was no unfamiliar person approaching the house. There was no vehicle that could not be accounted for. The camera footage, combined with the neighbor interviews, was building a wall around the home invasion theory, a wall made of absence. The intruder that Caleb Flynn had described simply did not exist in the physical record of that night. With the external investigation pointing away from the home invasion narrative, investigators turned their attention to the man who had made the call. The interrogation room is a specific kind of space. It is designed to be plain. The plainness is intentional. There is nothing for the eyes to settle on, nothing that provides comfort or distraction. There is a table, there are chairs, there is a camera mounted in a corner positioned to capture everything. The room communicates one thing above all else: you are here and there is nowhere to go. Caleb Flynn sat in that room. The detectives who entered with him were experienced. They had been trained in interview techniques that go far beyond simple question and answer. They understood body language. They understood the architecture of a lie. They understood that most people, when they have done something they know is wrong, carry that knowledge in ways that are physical as much as they are verbal. The interview began in the way most interviews do. Caleb was given the chance to tell his story again. The same story he had told the 911 dispatcher. The same story he had told the first officers on scene. The home invasion story, the intruder story. Detectives listened without interruption. They noted everything, not just the words but the pauses between words. Not just what was said, but what was not said. Not just the facts offered, but the way those facts were packaged and delivered. A person telling the truth about a traumatic event typically tells it in a certain way. The chronology is not always clean. The emotional content surfaces in unexpected places. The details are vivid in some areas and absent in others in ways that reflect genuine memory rather than deliberate construction. Caleb's account had a different texture. It was too organized in some places. The sequence of events he described had a logic to it that felt more like a narrative someone had planned than a memory someone was accessing. The emotional beats came at moments that seemed to experienced investigators just slightly calculated. Detectives began to ask follow-up questions, specific questions, questions about timing, questions about exactly where Caleb was at each moment, questions about what he heard first, what he saw first, what his first physical movement was after he realized something was wrong. These questions are traps, but they are honest traps. They are traps that only spring on a person who is navigating a constructed story rather than excavating a real memory. A person who was genuinely there, who genuinely witnessed something, can answer these questions without effort because the answers are simply what happened. Caleb struggled, not dramatically. He did not break down or contradict himself in obvious ways. But there were moments of hesitation where there should have been none. There were small inconsistencies in the fine details that did not survive comparison with the physical evidence. There were gaps. Detectives noted all of it. They kept the pace of the interview measured and steady. They did not reveal how much they already knew. They let Caleb talk. Because the more Caleb talked, the more visible the architecture of his story became, and the more clearly investigators could see where the walls did not meet. Every interrogation has a turning point. It is rarely a single dramatic moment of confession, despite what crime dramas suggest. More often, it is a gradual process, a series of small surrenders, a story that begins to bend under the weight of what investigators already know until sections of it simply collapse. Over the course of the interrogation, Caleb Flynn's account shifted. Not catastrophically at first. The shifts were small, tiny adjustments to timing. A detail that had been stated one way early in the interview that was now being described slightly differently. The kind of adjustments that a person telling the truth almost never makes because the truth does not require adjustment. Investigators introduced pieces of what they knew. Not all of it. Strategic fragments deployed to create pressure at specific points in the narrative. The camera footage, the neighbor accounts, the elements of the crime scene that did not align with an intruder's actions. Each piece of information was like a stone placed on a structure. The structure could hold one stone and two stones and three, but at a certain point, structures fail. What emerged from the interrogation was not a full confession. It was something more complicated. It was a man who had built a story and was trying to hold it together while the materials beneath it were being removed one by one. He maintained that there had been an intruder. He maintained that he had not harmed Andrea. But the details of how and when and where became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the physical record of that night. Investigators also had something that Caleb did not know they had. They had the forensic evidence from the bedroom. And that evidence told a story that was fundamentally incompatible with the home invasion narrative. The angle of the wound, the position of Andrea in relation to the evidence of disturbance, the specific physical details that forensic science can reconstruct with a degree of precision that human memory cannot match and human invention cannot accurately anticipate. The forensic story said that Andrea was shot at close range. It said that the specific circumstances of how she was positioned at the time were not consistent with a random intruder moving through the home. They were consistent with someone she knew, someone she had no reason to fear in that moment. Caleb Flynn said enough during that interrogation to give investigators what they needed. Not a confession in words, but a confession in the mounting impossibility of the story he was telling. And then the detectives walked out and the arrest warrant was prepared. The formal investigation that followed was methodical and extensive. Law enforcement in Miami County worked with state investigators to build a case that could survive a courtroom. A case built on the staging narrative had to be airtight. Defense attorneys would challenge every element. Every photograph, every measurement, every forensic conclusion would need to stand up to cross-examination. The crime scene analysis was the foundation. Forensic investigators returned to the Flynn home multiple times. They documented the scene with a level of precision that goes beyond what most people imagine when they picture an investigation. Every inch of the bedroom was mapped. The physical evidence was collected, cataloged, and sent to the state crime lab. The wound analysis was particularly significant. Ballistic and forensic pathology evidence established the trajectory and proximity of the gunshot. The findings were specific. They spoke to the position of the weapon relative to Andrea's at the moment it was fired. That information, combined with the position of Andrea's body and the overall layout of the scene, produced a reconstruction that detectives and prosecutors believed clearly contradicted the intruder story. The weapon itself became a focal point of the investigation. The firearm that killed Andrea was accounted for. Its history and its presence in the home were examined in detail. Investigators looked at the question of who had access to it and when, and what the physical evidence said about how it was used. Then there was the question of the staging itself. Investigators worked to identify exactly which elements of the crime scene had been deliberately manipulated. This required not just looking at the scene as it existed, but understanding what it would have looked like if things had happened the way they naturally would have in a genuine home invasion. The comparison between a genuine scene and this one was a core element of the prosecution's eventual case. Digital evidence was also examined thoroughly. Phones, text messages, call records. The digital footprint that modern life leaves behind was reviewed in detail. What it revealed about the state of the Flynn's relationship in the period leading up to Andrea's death became part of the fuller picture that investigators were assembling. Witness interviews continued beyond the initial canvas. People who knew Caleb and Andrea were spoken to. The accounts they gave of the relationship, of things they had observed and conversations they had been part of, contributed to the investigative picture in ways that strengthened the overall case. By the time prosecutors reviewed the evidence package that investigators had assembled, the decision on charges was not a difficult one. Caleb Flynn was formally charged with murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence. The criminal justice system moves on its own timeline. The charges against Caleb Flynn were serious. Murder in Ohio carries a sentence of 15 years to life. Felonious assault is a second-degree felony with a sentence of 2 to 8 years. Tampering with evidence is a third-degree felony. Taken together, the charges against Caleb represented the possibility of decades behind bars. The case moved through the preliminary stages of the judicial process. Caleb entered a plea. Legal proceedings unfolded with the kind of deliberate pace that frustrates everyone who watches from the outside, but that the system requires in order to function with fairness. Caleb Flynn faced the full weight of what the state of Ohio had assembled against him. The evidence presented to the court encompassed the forensic reconstruction of the crime scene, the ballistic and pathology findings, the digital evidence, the absence of any supporting evidence for the home invasion, claimed the security camera footage, and the detailed analysis of the staging that investigators had documented. The jury heard the case in its fullness. They heard the evidence that the prosecution presented. They heard the arguments that the defense made. They did what juries are constituted to do. They weighed the evidence against the standard of proof that the law requires. The verdict came back guilty. Caleb Flynn was convicted of the charges against him. The woman who had stood next to him in the photographs on their wedding day, who had shared a home with him, who had trusted him with her proximity and her vulnerability, had been killed. And the man who killed her had then spent the hours after her death trying to make it look like someone else was responsible. At sentencing, the judge had the full record of the case before them. The nature of the crime, The deliberate attempt to construct a false narrative, the destruction and manipulation of evidence, the fact that Andrea had no chance, no warning, no moment in which she could protect herself. Caleb Flynn received a sentence of 15 years to life on the murder conviction, with additional time for the other charges. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until he has served a significant portion of that sentence. Even if parole is eventually granted, he will carry the legal record of what he did to Andrea Flynn for the rest of his life. But the mechanics of sentencing are only one dimension of what this case reveals. The other dimension is far more personal. The interrogation footage in this case is worth examining in depth, not as entertainment, not as something voyeuristic, but because it offers a rare and specific window into the psychology of a person who has done something catastrophic and is attempting in real time to manage the consequences by constructing and maintaining a false account. Most people are not practiced liars. This sounds obvious, but its implications are important. When a person tells a lie about something trivial, the cognitive load is manageable. The stakes are low. The consequences of being caught are limited. And if the lie fails, there is generally an easy path to retreat. But when a person is lying about something that carries the weight of a murder charge, the cognitive demands are enormous. Every question requires the simultaneous management of the false story and the avoidance of the true one. Every detail needs to be consistent with every other detail. And any piece of external evidence that contradicts the story must somehow be accounted for or dismissed. The stress of this process leaves marks. Researchers who study deception have identified a range of behavioral and verbal indicators that tend to accompany high-stakes lying. No single indicator is definitive, but patterns matter. Clusters of indicators observed across time and across different questions tell a story of their own. In the Flynn interrogation, observers noted several things. The first was the quality of emotional expression. Caleb displayed distress throughout the interview, but the distress had a quality that experienced investigators found notable. It appeared at times to be expressed on cue, arriving at moments where emotional expression was contextually appropriate rather than appearing to surge spontaneously from genuine internal experience. The second was the nature of his memory performance. When asked about straightforward factual details of his own movements and actions on the night in question, Caleb showed hesitation that was inconsistent with genuine recall. Memory for one's own physical actions on a specific, significant night is typically robust. You remember where you were standing. You remember what you were doing with your hands. You remember the first thing you heard and the first thing you saw. These are not the details that fade. The third was his response to the introduction of contradicting evidence. When investigators began presenting elements of what they knew, Caleb's behavior shifted in ways consistent with what psychologists call narrative management. Rather than expressing the confusion or indignation that an innocent person confronted with impossible accusations typically displays, his responses had the quality of someone recalibrating a story rather than challenging a false accusation. There is also the broader psychological question of why. This is the question that true crime audiences always arrive at because it is the question that human beings cannot help asking. What makes a person arrive at the decision to take the life of someone they promise to love and protect? What happens in the internal world of a person in the moments before that decision is carried out? Psychology does not offer simple answers. The circumstances of troubled relationships, of whatever combination of resentment, desperation, entitlement, and misperception lead to this kind of act, are always specific to the individuals involved. What we can say is that the violence did not begin with a gun. It began somewhere earlier in a process of dehumanization, of reducing another person's life to the status of a problem to be solved. The staging tells us something important about Caleb's psychology in the aftermath. The decision to arrange the scene, to call 911 with a constructed story, to sit in an interrogation room and maintain that story for as long as possible. All of this reflects a belief that intelligence and performance could substitute for truth. It reflects a certain kind of arrogance, the belief that the investigative process could be fooled if the story was good enough. It was not good enough. It never is. The scene had been arranged for an audience. It found one, but that audience was wearing badges and carrying evidence collection kits. It would be easy at this point in a story like this to let Andrea Flynn become a background figure. True crime as a genre has a documented tendency to do this. The perpetrator becomes the central character because the perpetrator's psychology and actions drive the narrative. The victim, the actual person who was lost, can end up occupying a role rather than a life. Andrea deserves more than a role. She was 26 years old. She had a family who loved her. She had friends who knew her voice and her laugh and the specific way she reacted when something surprised her. She had opinions about small things and feelings about big ones. She had a history that was entirely her own, built before she ever met Caleb Flynn, and a future that should have extended far beyond the night he took it from her. The people who knew Andrea have described her in the terms that the people closest to us always use: kind, genuine, someone who made the people around her feel seen. These descriptions carry no rhetorical weight. They are not arguments. They are simply the things people say when they are trying to communicate the particular quality of a person they loved. She trusted her home to be safe. She trusted the person in that home with her. That trust was not a weakness. It was what human beings extend to the people they have chosen to build a life with. It was reasonable, it was deserved, it was violated in the most irreversible way possible. The grief that Andrea's family carried through this process, through the investigation and the trial and the sentencing, is not something that ends when the verdict is read. The legal resolution of a homicide provides something. It provides accountability. It provides a measure of justice. It provides the knowledge that the person responsible has been identified and will face consequences. But it does not give anyone their person back. Andrea's family had to sit in a courtroom and watch the detailed reconstruction of the night she was killed. They had to hear testimony about the forensic evidence. They had to be in the same room as the man who took her from them and who had then tried to make it look like a stranger had done it. They had to be present for all of it because being present was the only thing left they could do for her. That is what victims' families do. They show up. They refuse to let the person they lost be reduced to a case number. They keep the reality of who was actually lost visible in a process that could easily make that person invisible. Andrea Flynn was not invisible. She was a 26-year-old woman with a whole life ahead of her. And that is the most important thing in this entire story. The legal system handled what it could. But the weight of what was lost remains with the people who knew her. Cases like this one have a way of surfacing questions that extend beyond the individual circumstances. The first question is about staged crime scenes. The concept of a staged crime scene is not unique to this case. It appears with a frequency that might surprise people who think of it as rare. In cases of domestic homicide, specifically, staging occurs in a significant proportion of instances. The perpetrator, having committed an act they know is wrong, attempts to convert the scene from a crime committed by someone known to the victim into a crime committed by an unknown intruder. The logic behind staging is understandable in a terrible way. The home invasion narrative places suspicion as far from the person responsible as possible. It creates an alternative culprit, one who is by definition untraceable because that person does not exist. And it places the person who was actually responsible in the role of a second victim, someone who also suffered, someone who called for help, someone who should be comforted rather than investigated. What perpetrators who stage crime scenes consistently underestimate is the sophistication of modern forensic investigation. Investigators who process genuine home invasion homicides and investigators who process staged scenes have a large body of comparative knowledge to draw from. They know what real scenes look like. They know the specific patterns of disturbance that result from an actual intruder moving through an unfamiliar space in a high-stress situation. And they know how those patterns differ from the patterns that result from someone arranging a scene with deliberate intent. The second question this case raises is about the danger that exists within domestic relationships. The statistics on domestic homicide in the United States are sobering. Partners and ex-partners represent the single largest category of perpetrators in women's homicides. The home, the space that should be the safest, is statistically one of the most dangerous places for women. These numbers are not abstract. They represent individual human beings, each one of them a person like Andrea. The warning signs of a relationship moving toward danger are not always visible from the outside. Sometimes they are not visible to the person inside the relationship either. But the research on domestic violence escalation consistently identifies patterns: increasing control, isolation from support networks, Volatile emotional responses, a sense on the part of one partner that the other is a possession rather than a person. The third question is about performance and authenticity. Caleb Flynn had experience in front of cameras. He had stood on the American Idol stage and performed for a national television audience. He knew at least professionally how to present himself, how to project an emotion, how to create an impression. And yet the performance he delivered in the 911 call and in the interrogation room was not good enough. The investigators who encountered him were not a television audience. They were not watching for entertainment. They were watching for truth. The skills that serve a person well on a stage do not serve a person well in an interrogation room because the audience is different. A television audience suspends disbelief. An investigator specifically does not. This case is also a reminder about the power of absence as evidence. The security camera footage that showed no intruder. The neighbor interviews that corroborated no unusual activity. The forensic evidence that aligned with no random encounter. These are all forms of nothing. And yet that nothing was the most powerful evidence in the case. The home invasion narrative required certain things to exist in the physical record. Those things did not exist. And the absence of those things was in the end just as damning as any piece of physical evidence collected from the scene. Cases like this one change how investigators approach every scene afterward. They are in a grim way lessons in the craft of finding the truth. Caleb Flynn sat in a courtroom in Ohio and heard a verdict read that will define the rest of his life. Andrea Flynn never sat in that courtroom. She never had the chance to speak for herself in any venue that followed her death. Her voice in this story, as in the stories of so many victims of domestic homicide, is constructed from what the people who knew her remember, from what the evidence suggests, and from the imagination that all of us bring to the task of trying to understand a person we will never meet. The staging of a crime scene is an act of disrespect that operates on multiple levels. It disrespects the people who investigate it by treating their professionalism as something that can be deceived with a carefully arranged room. It disrespects the judicial system by treating the process of justice as something that can be navigated with a good enough story. And most profoundly, it disrespects the victim by making her death not just a loss, but a tool, something to be shaped and positioned in service of the person who caused it. Andrea was not a tool. She was not a prop in someone else's narrative. She was a 26-year-old woman who had the right to live out her life, to make her choices, to build whatever future she was capable of imagining for herself. The investigation in Tipp City, Ohio worked. The forensic science worked. The patience and professionalism of the investigators worked. And the truth, which had been buried under a stage scene and a practiced story, was eventually excavated and placed before a jury that understood what it was looking at. But here is the question this case leaves open. How many cases like this one are there in which the staging is good enough, or the investigation is under-resourced, or the forensic science is unavailable, or the jury cannot reach the standard of proof required? How many Andreas are there whose stories end with the home invasion narrative accepted with the staging, never detected with the truth never surfaced? We do not know the answer to that question, but we know that it is not zero. If you are in a relationship that has become a place of fear, the resources exist. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text the word START to 74741. These resources are confidential. They are staffed by people who understand that leaving is not always simple, that the danger in these situations is real, and that the help being offered is without judgment. Andrea Flynn was 26 years old. She is remembered by her family, by her friends, by everyone who knew her voice and her laugh, and the specific way she moved through the world that was uniquely hers. She is not a case number. She is not a stage scene. She is a person who was lost and who deserved far better than what she got. Remember her name.